I too was really interested in to hear the diversity of backgrounds we have in the room today, and there's a lot of experts in here. I'm going to go over a lot of different topics, kind of skin deep, and a lot of you will know a lot about some of these things. So it'll be fun to do, and I look forward to talking to you later. Please interrupt if I don't make something clear. But what I'm going to talk about today is kind of present some of the results of the science of living shorelines, what we know, the results of research that we've done both on natural shoreline habitats, the impacts of hardened shorelines, and some of the more recent work that has been done on how living shorelines may function. I just want to acknowledge Rachel Gitman, who's worked with me on this presentation over the last year or two. We've been combining slides. Rachel's in Hartford, Connecticut, I think. Let's see. Oh, here we go. At the another Living Shoreline Summit. So what I'm going to briefly go over the function and role of natural shoreline habitats. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about shoreline erosion. We've done some studies. There have been several studies done on shoreline erosion rates in North Carolina. I'm going to talk a little bit about, to answer your question, why we shouldn't build a great big gigantic bulkhead where we don't have to on our shoreline habitats. And then I'm going to review some of the data that we have and some of the experience we have with living shorelines here in North Carolina. So you all are familiar in this room with North Carolina coastal habitats, and this is really the intertidal habitat. So we have salt marsh sort of at the top end. They may be fronted by tidal flats. They may have oyster reefs. They may have SAV associated with them. But these are the habitats that occupy that shoreline that we're so interested in. And they do a lot of really good things for us in the course of them just living their life and doing their thing. Let's see. Is this? Oh, that's the pointer. Here we go. I want to start off talking mostly about salt marshes because this is really the key habitat associated with living shorelines. And so this slide comes from talks I've put together for the central part of the state. And I'm going to adapt it a little bit in a minute for the northern part of the state because it's very different. But here we have Spartina alterniflora flooded here, so it's high tide. And marshes occupy this relatively narrow elevation band, roughly between mean high water and mean sea level, maybe a little bit below mean sea level. And so the horizontal distance that marsh can extend is going to depend on the slope of the land. Okay, and very small changes in elevation across that range, that intertidal range, can result in changes in species distribution. In the central part of the state, you've got Spartina alterniflora, or smooth cordgrass, which starts right about mean sea level in its tall form. As you get up to about mean high water, it gets shorter and shorter. And then somewhere around mean high water, we get a more diverse assemblage of species. Spartina patens, or salt marsh hay, you may know it as, Disticulus spicata. And then we get Juncus romerianus way up at the top of the intertidal zone. And so even over about 100 centimeters, or 3.5 feet or so, that's our tide range. And we have this diverse range of species. It's going to be a little bit different up here, as we'll see in a minute. Another thing I want to point out is that what we see here is the above ground portion. These marsh plants have a tremendous amount of below ground production. And frequently what you see above ground, there's as much as twice as more below ground root production below the sediment surface, which is really important, obviously, for stabilizing shorelines. The other thing I'll just mention here at the bottom, that these marshes can grow in a variety of sediments, from a very sandy substrate to a more silt clay muddy substrate. They're often nitrogen limited. I think Ellen's going to talk to you a little bit more about nitrogen and phosphorus and potentially fertilizing transplants. This down here is just a reference I put in that helps you take, if you have a digital elevation model or a surface elevation for your site, it'll help you figure out where to plant your plants, knowing their elevation distribution. So North Carolina wetlands, it's a little bit different up here. You have this graph over here, everything in red is below 1.5 meters in elevation. And you can see as you go up the state, we get much flatter topography, much lower land. You also have much reduced tide range. This is the difference between mean low water and mean sea level. You can see out along the ocean, down in the central part of the states. we have about a 3 to up to 4 foot tide range. But when you get inside the sounds here, you're talking less than half a foot to even non-tidal areas. And this makes a big difference in the plant distribution that you have in the northern part of the state. So for example, here you'll see along the shoreline Juncus romerianus. You'll see big cordgrass, Spartina sinusoides. Here we have some Juncus. And in the background we have Phragmites. And that's another issue when we talked about this. I said, is there things I should talk about? And it was asked that I talk about Phragmites, which is an invasive species here. So there is a little bit of native Phragmites around. I don't think there's any left in North Carolina. Many of you are probably familiar with Phragmites. It outcompetes native Spartina and Juncus along the shoreline, and you'll see it along roadsides, next to bridges. Most of you are probably very familiar with it. It quickly colonizes disturbed areas. It has this clonal growth that once it gets into an area, it can extend into saltier areas where it might initially be able to colonize. And it's really hard to get rid of. I don't know, probably several of you have been involved in Phragmites removal efforts. People can burn it, they spray glycophosphate on it, they tear it out mechanically, and quite often it comes back. It's a really vigorous plant. So what does it do? Is it bad? We spend a lot of money getting rid of it. Well, this is a shot of its root structure. Between that and trapping sediments, it does build surface elevation. It does alter fish and wildlife habitat. It's not that it doesn't have any habitat value, but it does support somewhat different species, and as it builds that surface elevation, it can reduce fisheries habitat, for example. It does have a really high rate of primary production. One of the biggest problems, I like how I put that little skip in there, it's like, trying to illustrate the problem, is you can't see through the stuff. And so when people have it adjacent to their houses, they really don't like it. And if you've ever been in a canyon of Phragmites marshes, you can't see over it. And all that primary production can create a real fire hazard in the wintertime. We know less about some of its other functions. Presumably, it's going to attenuate wave energy. It's probably going to sequester a lot of carbon. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And as I said, it probably does as good or better job as some other species in terms of keeping up with sea level rise. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I think you're definitely going to have to deal with it if you're doing living shoreline projects in this part of the state. So let's talk about why we value these habitats. As most of you are probably familiar, these plants, these salt marshes in particular, oyster reefs and seagrass, SAB in particular, they provide really important habitat for fish, birds, other wildlife. In North Carolina, over 90% of the commercially harvested species are estuarine dependent. So this fish spawn offshore, those larval fish come in the wintertime, they occupy the estuaries during their juvenile life stage, and these are the habitats that they occupy. They're also really good, as we'll see, at stabilizing the shoreline. They attenuate wave energy, they hold down the sediments in place. They also, so part of that process is trapping sediments. So they improve water quality. They trap sediments, they process nutrients, remove nitrogen from the system, and they also store carbon. And finally, of course, all of these together make for a really important habitat for a very important industry of tourism in this part of the state. So we value them tremendously, and we live on top of them. And therein lies the rub, because we want to be sometimes exactly where they are, right on the shoreline. Fortunately, so one of the other problems ultimately for us, although it helps when we're designing living shorelines, is that many of those functions that I described occur especially at the marsh edge. So even narrow fringing marshes can be really valuable despite their narrow extent. Fish and shrimp are predominantly found in the edge of the marsh. In the first 10 meters of the marsh, they occupy that edge. Waves are attenuated very effectively within 15, 20, 30 feet. A marsh can knock down a lot of the wave energy that comes in. Sediments that are trapped, as waves come in or the tide water comes into the marsh, laden with sediments, gets knocked down, that energy gets knocked down, the sediments are deposited at the marsh edge. So you don't need hundreds of meter wides of marsh to get a lot of these ecosystem services. So we're interested in shoreline stabilization and we're interested in shoreline erosion. So one of the ecosystem services that we're most interested in is wave attenuation. And we have a lot of data on that, on how effective Spartina alternate flora is. And other marsh plants are going to function in a similar fashion. But there's been a lot of studies of this, and they've shown that 50% of the wave energy can be reduced or eliminated within about 15 feet of the marsh. And a marsh can actually attenuate 90% of the wave energy in just 20 meters or 60 feet of marsh. The higher the canopy, the thicker the stem density, the more plant biomass you have, the more effective they are at reducing wave energy. Now, the one issue that we have to think about a little bit is the wave energy. So in this picture here, you've got the water well up into the marsh. But of course, at low tide, this isn't going to be very effective at reducing the wave energy, right? Because the wave isn't even in the marsh. And so, this is when the marsh is most effective, is when the tide height is right there at the canopy height. But then if we get a storm tide and a big storm surge and the tide water is way up here, 2 or 3 times the canopy height, this marsh is going to function as a drag coefficient, but it's not going to attenuate wave energy, okay? So depending on the water level is how effective that marsh is at attenuating wave energy. So let's see, I'm going to show you, I hope, a video. Oops. What do you think I need to do? What's that? Oh, right. She told me that. No, I don't never remember it. No. Let's go back.
Click on the spot with the mouse.
It says it's playing. Is it playing? I hope you all can see this. So this is a wave coming into a living shoreline on Pivers Island, and you can see those plants flattening in the foreground, and in the background they're still pretty erect, and those are some pretty big waves, and it's just laying back and absorbing all that energy and really reducing the energy that's actually hitting the shoreline behind there. So they're very effective. Another thing that salt marshes do very well is they trap sediments, and that does 2 things. First of all, it removes sediment from the water column, so it improves water quality. But it also allows that salt marsh to build its surface elevation and actually, for example, keep up with sea level rise. So that marsh surface increases in volume over time. Another thing we found in looking at this is that storm events are often a source of sediment to the marsh. When those big waves come in with all that suspended sediment and those marshes knock down that wave energy, it deposits a lot of sediment to that marsh surface. And these things allow marshes to keep up with sea level rise. And this also facilitates the carbon sequestration ability of marshes. Now, I'm not sure, some of us in some of our little worlds, all we talk about, it seems like, is the term blue carbon and carbon sequestration. And what this is all about is there's a real interest right now in trying to use natural habitats to reduce the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And a salt marsh, as it turns out, is one of the most effective habitats in the world at this. Per meter square, marshes can sequester carbon as well or better than any other habitat. And so they have really high rates of primary production. They've got all that below ground material that I mentioned to you. They trap all this sediment and bury all that. And there's actually a developing market, okay, for the CO2 that marshes are able to bury. And I think in the future, there may be some financial incentives for transplanting marshes and putting marshes in the ground for this CO2 function. So this is a methodology that was just released. So if you're interested in that aspect, there's a link. This just shows you some of the devices we use to measure these changes in surface elevation. This is a SET, or surface elevation. You may have heard of these. It's a permanent benchmark. You put this arm in it, and you can measure repeated measures down the sediment surface. I don't know how well you can see this in the back there, but this is a core that we've taken. We put down a layer of feldspar, this bright white layer. You put that on the marsh surface. You come back a few months later, and you can actually measure the amount of sediment that's come in and deposited on the surface of the marsh over time. So let's talk, so those are the functions of marshes. Now let's turn to the problem, which is shoreline erosion. So here we have a sediment bank, a salt marsh that's been eroding, swamp forests. These are our three primary shoreline types. So what causes shoreline? Well, wave energy, wind wave energy. Of course, then we get storm events, which cause the water levels to increase. One of our big problems is disruption in sediment supply. In a lot of parts of the state and around the country, we've dammed, we've done other things that have reduced the sediment that's arriving to our estuaries. A little bit of sediment's a good thing, as we just said. It helps the marshes keep up. Changes in shoreline topography, things that work to remove vegetation, and a big issue can be boat wakes. So it's not just wind wave energies, it's proximity to navigation channels and boat wakes. One of those big barges going down can put a bigger wake on the shoreline than it'll see from any storm all year. So what drives wind wave energy is fetch, so the distance that the wind blows over, the distance that the prevailing winds are at. So if you're exposed to the prevailing wind energy, the prevailing wind direction, you're going to have a lot more wave energy than if you're not, even if you have the same fetch. The bathymetry, deeper water, if you're adjacent to deeper water, larger waves can build up than if you're in shallow water. Okay, so those three things, fetch, your prevailing wind and wind history, and bathymetry, that really, you can very accurately model your wave energy using those three parameters. Boat wakes, as I mentioned, are kind of an outlier. The other thing is the geomorphology of the area. So what is the slope? And of course here we don't have much slope. And the shoreline type, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So here, unfortunately, as you see, as you go down the state, for you guys, you have the largest fetches. And you also have the higher average shoreline erosion rates in this part of the state. This is a study that Stan Riggs and Dorothy Ames did in 2003. As you get down in the Neuse River, the average across all shoreline types is about 0.5 meter a year. And down here in the New River estuary, which is much less fetch, we have about 0.3 of a meter a year. So although overall across the state, there's a large-scale correlation with increased fetch, higher erosion rates, all of these places found that within those study areas, there was actually not a great correlation between fetch, wave energy, and local erosion rate. So there are other factors at play, which is going to be important when you start doing site-specific designs. One of the things that varies that erosion rate according to your fetch energy, or according to your wave energy rather, is the type of shoreline that you have. Sediment banks, given any wave energy arriving at a site, a sediment bank is going to erode faster than a salt marsh. And a salt marsh is going to erode a little bit faster than a swamp forest, although note that swamp forests aren't really found at very high wave energies. This is data from the New River estuary. These are erosion rates, so the longer the bar here, the higher erosion rate. Here's the salt marsh erosion rate in the New River estuary. Here's the sediment bank erosion rate. If you have a sediment bank with just a little bit of salt marsh in front of it, you actually significantly reduce the erosion rate of that sediment bank. So one of the questions I'm sure a lot of the people in this room are going to want to know is, well, what wave energy conditions can I put a living shoreline in, and what kind of shoreline do we need to build for a specific wave energy site? So this is a look we did at the width of salt marshes across a range of wave energies. And so this is 700 meters up here, for those of you who can't see in the back. 700 meters wide marsh here. And then this is increasing wave energy. There's about a 5-mile fetch. Let's say about here is about a 5-mile fetch. And so what we find is that these this gives us some guide as to the kind of, that's what I thought I just want to go, this gives us a guide as to the wave energies where a marsh will make it. And generally speaking, you're talking about fetches of at most 5 miles or modeled wave heights of less than 0.2 meters. One of the interesting things is now we have these vertical bars on this graph. This is existing stone sill living shorelines that have been built in the state. So some of them clearly probably needed, some of them maybe not. And this just showing you, this is a site down there off Harker's Island where 20 years ago marsh was planted, oyster reef was put out in front of it. This picture was taken right after Hurricane Irene. This site's been there for 20 years and it's way out here on the end of the wave energy where we find marshes. So these systems can make it in certain situations in fairly high energy areas. Another example, this is a fairly new project that we put in on the Rachel Carson Reserve. This is an aerial photograph of it. This picture right here, taking that, we put a big oyster sill out in front of this. You can see it does have a nice shallow mud flat in front of it, which is the only reason you could do that with this kind of fetch it has there. It does have something else to help break the waves. We planted marsh behind it. Over time, we've seen sedimentation behind that sill. We've seen, I think you can see up here, we've seen the marsh plants grow. So we're really trying to push the envelope at this site and try and provide information as what is the upper boundaries at which you can use a living shoreline to stabilize a shoreline. So shoreline hardening, we've been talking about marshes and oysters, but that's not what people use. There's what, I think 800 miles, I just put on, I don't have this in this talk, I think there's 800 miles of hardened shoreline. There's more than that, maybe that's every year. I can't remember, there's a lot of hardened shoreline, there's 5 miles of living shorelines in the state. So people continue to use these approaches, seawalls, big breakwaters, groins, jetties, of course bulkheads are the predominant method used in North Carolina, riprap revetments. Why not use these? Well, we lose a lot of the things that we value when we put in a hardened shoreline. So this is the natural habitat where we have a tidal marsh with a gentle slope. We have maybe seagrass offshore, maybe we have oysters here. We have fish and bird habitat. We have all those other functions I just described about attenuating waves, trapping sediments. When we put in a bulkhead, what happens is instead of absorbing the wave energy like the salt marsh does, now that wave energy is just reflected right back offshore. And what typically happens is in front of the bulkheads you get scour, you eliminate any vegetation there, you get this deep habitat instead of this shallow habitat. Well, deep habitat is really good for big fish that want to eat little fish. So it's good big fish habitat, but in terms of refuge for those juvenile species, which we really care about, they lose that refuge when you go from very shallow water to very deep water. So the bulkheads, I would make the point in terms of permitting, although the bulkhead is put in on private property, those adverse impacts extend into what we call public trust resources. Those adverse impacts, that bulkhead, remove some of the things in below the mean high water line. So we'd like to come up with something, another approach than this where we can. Another problem with bulkheads is they create this problem of coastal squeeze. So when there's not a seawall present, the salt marshes with sea level rise are going to migrate landward. And you can see this wherever you drive around here. You look, you see the ghost forest, you see the marsh moving into the forest, and that's what's happening. The marsh is moving landward with sea level rise. However, when we put a seawall in, all of a sudden this marsh can't move up, and it's stuck between rising sea level on this side and the seawall on this. And so we just squeeze that marsh right out of its intertidal zone. So what are the alternatives? And here's yet another definition. I think this was recently put in a NOAA publication. A living shoreline incorporates vegetation alone or in combination with some other type of harder shoreline structure where needed. And this is the main point, is that they maintain the continuity of the land-water continuum and reduce erosion while providing habitat value. And this just shows you a few examples. I guess we've got the room as dark as we can get it, don't we, Whitney? This is Pivers Island. This is an oyster reef and a salt marsh planted on a eroding beach area. This is down in Harker's Island where a stone sill was used with Spartina alterniflora. Some of you may be familiar with this area. This is a Festival Park site where there's a sill and then a large area of open water where I think they planted SAV there, and then marsh behind that. So in trying to prevent or alter this movement from saving these shoreline habitats or saving shoreline property by putting in a hardened shoreline, These are the range of living shorelines we just have talked about. And a number of questions have come up that we've tried to address over the last 6, 7, 8 years. What are the suite of ecosystem services that a living shoreline can provide? How effective are they at maintaining the shoreline? And more pressing is the question, how well are they going to be able to keep up with sea level rise? So I'll try to briefly go through some of this. Let's talk about fish habitat first. I mentioned that when you put in the bulkhead, you lose that shallow water, you lose your vegetation, and you end up with something that looks a lot more like this instead of this. There have been a number of published studies now, both here and in other states, that show very conclusively that living shorelines, with or without stone sills, provide a much better habitat for fishes and crustaceans than do bulkheads, and that the sills in particular can function similar to natural fringing marsh and oyster reefs in terms of providing habitat for fish. These are very clear results. And I've put a couple of citations here, but these kinds of studies have now been done in quite a few places. I'm pretty confident about we can say that. What about erosion protection? What happens when a hurricane comes over a living shoreline? This is a study, the top part of this is a study that Rachel Gitman did. Here's track of Hurricane Irene. Rachel looked at, these boxes got moved a little bit. I must have moved something. Rachel didn't do studies out in the middle of the ocean. She did studies along the shoreline. And looked at the estuarine shoreline in these areas. And she found that in some areas, up to 75% of the bulkheads were damaged. That was in this area up here. In none of these studies did she find a loss in elevation. This is Frisco, Hatteras, Bogue Banks, and this is Rodanthe in this area. A lot of bulkhead damage. Also during Hurricane Irene, we looked at what happened in a variety of shorelines around Pivers Island. Again, we found, as I mentioned before, we actually had sediment added to the salt marsh, not removed to the salt marsh. We found no erosion of the edge of either the marsh edge or where the marsh contacted the grass. We did find that behind the bulkheads, much as Rachel found, we had overwash and scour behind the bulkhead. And we also found scour associated with riprap revetments on the island. This is a series of pictures that Rachel took in Bogue Banks. This is the bulkhead before Hurricane Irene. This is the bulkhead after Irene. Almost immediately adjacent to that was a living shoreline that had just been put in like a month ago. And this is how it looked afterwards. It did just fine. The waves go up, over, they get attenuated to some degree. They're able to come back out with very, very little damage or change to the shoreline. Let's talk a little bit about sea level rise and shoreline stabilization. This is a historic trace using a variety of methods of sea level rise from 1600 to present. You can see that it's going up, and you can see that it's going up faster, consistent with every model that I've seen. The most recent North Carolina Science Panel issued region-specific projections of sea level rise throughout the state, and the highest rates of sea level rise are for this part of the state because the land up here is subsiding faster than it is down around Wilmington. So in addition to global sea level rise, relative sea level rise as what's happening in the ocean along with what's happening to your local land. So your land is subsiding a little bit more than elsewhere in the state. So you're looking at somewhere between 5 inches to a foot of sea level rise in 30 years, which is the lifetime of some of these structures. And when people buy property, so it's starting to get in the time frame that is really going to affect our lifetime. I hope my lifetime. Fortunately, to a degree, salt marshes and oyster reefs have the ability to keep up with sea level rise. This graph here shows, I've talked about this a little bit, but this is just a model that shows as sea level rises, it actually increases tidal flooding, which increases the sediment supply that arrives on the salt marsh. Also, marshes respond to stress by creating more below ground production. So between sediments, added sediment supply and added below ground production, the marsh actually builds its surface up very well and can increase its surface elevation. There was a recent estimate worldwide of salt marsh surface elevation change. 60% of the marshes worldwide were increasing their surface elevation at a rate equal or greater than local sea level rise. Very recently, Tony Rodriguez, a geologist at UNC Institute of Marine Sciences, looked at oyster reefs in the central part of the state and found that those oyster reefs were accreting at greater than a centimeter per year in places, so higher than local sea level rise. This isn't, obviously 60% did means 40% didn't, and that's what we're concerned about, of course. And one of the main concerns is sediment supply. You have to have adequate sediment supply for that marsh to be able to maintain itself, and not too high a rate of land subsidence. So let's talk a little about stone sills, which is one of the more popular formulations of living shorelines in the state. We looked at a series of stone sills. We had a study where we looked at 4 sites with paired reference and paired stone sill. And at every single one of them, the sill marshes were accreting sediments at 3 to 4 millimeters per year, and the nearby natural reference marshes were at about 1 to 2 millimeters per year. In some cases, they weren't keeping up. This just shows you, because it's so obvious, here's the stone sill. We collected digital elevation models, so we looked at the sediment surface over time. So we took the sediment surface of 2007, made a digital elevation model, walked our bike, got sediment surface again, made another digital elevation model, subtracted them. Where there was a loss in sediment, these marsh areas are in blue. Where there was a gain in sediment, the marsh areas are in red. We had these sets, what I just described to you. We had sets at the lower end, sets at the upper end. This is a sill site. This is a nearby natural reference marsh, low set, high set. This is the 0 line, with this line 0. This is mean sea level. And what you can clearly see, the natural marsh, especially on the lower end, lost surface elevation over time. In contrast, the sill, because as that tide water comes over, bringing with it sediment, that sediment falls out, it gained surface elevation at both the low and the high end. So we have some very good data now that shows you that stone sills do increase marsh surface accretion. There's some habitat trade-offs in there that we'll talk about in a minute, but it's pretty clear that they can do that effectively. Next question we get sometimes is how long before you see the benefits of a living shoreline? Here's a couple of examples. This is a stone sill. 1 year, it takes 2 or 3 years for that marsh to really establish itself. What frequently happens, as I just showed you, you start off with bare sediment behind the sill. Sometimes it's really difficult to maintain a subtidal zone because the sediment accretes so fast, and you actually get the marsh after 4 or 5 years growing up into the sill. This is a living shoreline that did not use rock, just used oyster reef. You can see we put oyster reef down here. We kept adding oyster reef over time. 6 years later, we had oyster reef across this whole thing and a very, very thick, healthy marsh. And we completely eliminated the erosion problems we had between this sandy beach. You can see how ripped up this, you can see how eroded this lawn is. We had a maintenance area, all these trees got torn out, and we created a stable shoreline with just oyster reef and marsh grass. I invite you to come down to Pivers Island and see that. So what do we need to do? Well, we certainly need, I think one of the most important questions is, what is the wave energy setting? Where can you use oyster? Where can you use marsh? I mentioned this dredge island post-Irene. I mentioned this NEARS demo project down there on the Rachel Carson Reserve. Here's another situation where we just use oyster. So we really want to try and figure out, and I think this is one of the crucial things to work on, is under what wave energy setting can we use what approach to living shorelines. But you don't always need stone sills. There are trade-offs with them, as I mentioned. One problem, which I haven't talked yet about, is just putting that stone sill on the bottom. There's real value to that shallow subtidal bottom. It gets light, there's a lot of algal growth there, there's a lot of secondary production, worms, the shallow water provides refuge for fish. So we really want to minimize how wide of an area we cover with rock. And of course, the taller we build the rock, the wider the rock is. So we want to get enough rock there that it's needed, but not more than that. Because we lose that, we lose that shallow subtidal habitat, and we also lose that low marsh. And if the marsh isn't being inundated, it can't provide fish habitat, and it doesn't do some of those other things it does as effectively. So it's really we have to be really careful about this, about designing appropriately. So just to summarize, I don't think I said this yet, but a really useful guideline is just look at adjacent shorelines and see where the plants are living there, and use that as your guide to tidal elevations. Am I doing okay?
You're good.
Okay. I tend to go too long sometimes, so, okay. So use adjacent shorelines as a guide to what will live there and at what elevations you should be planting. Salt marsh vegetation does occur across a range of wave energy setting, and kind of the outward end would be a fetch of about 5 miles. If there's proximity to navigation channels, boat wakes can be a real problem. As I hope I've shown you, marsh vegetation can effectively reduce waves, stabilize sediments, and increase sedimentation. Stone sills further increase sediment accretion and elevation gain in fringing marshes. This does in turn result in a change in the marsh vegetation from low marsh to high marsh. So marsh sills present some trade-offs in habitat types, loss of subtidal area and low marsh. Oysters can be a viable addition to living shoreline designs in many settings. That might be a little more of a challenge here, I think, than further south in the state. Hardened structures, such as bulkheads, riprap, do not keep up with sea level rise. And most importantly, they don't provide those ecosystem services that natural shorelines do. And they may not perform as well during storms as a living shoreline does. And finally, incorporating marsh and oyster reefs into a living shoreline approach can result in cost-effective, sustainable shoreline protection. And this is Pivers Island. This is my lab. This is our living shoreline. Thank you very much.